Good morning. Again, as every week, thank you very much for your interest of being here in our not the last session, but we're almost there. Actually, we are planning to have last webinar on December the 4th, so we can show you an applied exercise of microsimulation. Yeah, the idea is to take a sample of households from an actual household data set. I don't remember what country, but we will take a sample of those households, and the idea is to implement the microsimulation exercise from the very beginning, so you can be involved in how to identify the different income concepts, how to add, how to subtract, how to identify the different fiscal interventions that we have been discussing over the last few weeks. So, as for now, and because of that, I'll try to make this presentation very short. I said the same in the last session in Spanish. It was intended to be a very short presentation, but it took like almost 2 hours actually. But now I promise I'll make this presentation very short. Because during the last session we will discuss in more detail some of the elements and concepts. As for today, I will focus on describing the rationale of the other side of the puzzle, of the last piece of the puzzle, which is the social expenditure, social transfers, etc., etc. So, as we discussed last week or 2 weeks ago, I'm kind of lost. We talk about the different taxes, the different rates that we have to consider, that we have to identify in order to properly construct the model or to implement the microsimulation. And that part is important. I mean, I remember that I emphasized that it is not that important to know the equations, etc., because at the end it's only about adding and subtracting amounts given the different concepts. But the main part and the more complex part of a microsimulation exercise is to properly understand the rationale, the complexity of how the different systems are in place, are working, right? So on one hand, the taxation side, which basically requires to understand what are the taxes, who pay the taxes, what are the different rates, how the taxes are designed, for instance, and as you can recall, not only about direct taxes on personal income, but the indirect taxes levied on quantities, on prices, on a mix of both, or on geographical location, or even on the content of the goods, right? So, for instance, we mentioned the example of sugar, of the sugar content of some beverages. So those products are typically levied, are taxed with an indirect tax. VAT, but they are also taxed with an additional rate of depending on the sugary content, right? So we have to properly understand those, the different mechanisms, the different rates, etc., so we can construct the microsimulation model. And for this side it's probably even more complex, because every country, I mean, and this is different from country to country, of course, but more often than not, the social policy instruments are more in number than taxes. So we can have a lot of subsidies on prices paid. We can have a lot of transfers in cash or in kind, or we can have basically that, right? Conditional and non-conditional transfers and in-kind transfers, so subsidies. So this is important to understand how this system, let's call it the redistribution system, works. So if our goal is to simulate the changes in the potential changes in any fiscal instrument as part of a fiscal reform, we have to understand what are the policies put in place at that moment, in that specific context. Who are the beneficiaries? What are the rules, even the legal rules, on which these programs and policies are based? So we can properly identify the target population in our household data set, right? So as you probably remember when we discussed the taxation part, the idea is basically to open the household data set, and then we will see a vector of incomes as reported by the population at the moment when they were interviewed. So it's our responsibility to decompose, or to decompose that aggregated amount into the different taxes, into the different social expenditure instruments, so we can model changes to any of those individual concepts, right? So for instance, if we opened the household survey and we analyze the vector of incomes reported by households, we can see that, I don't know, one household is reporting an income of £500, for instance. And the household also tell us that out of those 500, probably 50 correspond to social transfers, right? So now, at that moment, we have an element, we have an element that has been identified, which is an amount of social transfers. But within that element of social transfers, there will be a lot of policies affecting that amount. Probably those £50 are composed by the sum of £10 of the conditional cash transfer program, the flagship program. Then another 12 could be could come from non-contributory pensions for an elderly population living in the household. Another £5 could be the result of a transfer for the household to buy schooling supplies, etc., etc. So the idea is that based on the legal information, on the rules of the program, and on information, external information about what are the different programs in practice in that country, our goal is to disentangle the aggregated component of income so we can identify the individual elements that add up to that aggregated amount. So at the end, and this is the microsimulation. The microsimulation consists precisely on changing those individual elements in amounts or in rates. It depends on the reform, but let's say that one potential reform is to increase the amount of the transfer of the flagship conditional cash transfer program. So by having identified the amount of that element, then we can, of course, add or subtract the amount proposed by the government in the new reform. So at the end, we can measure poverty and inequality and try to capture the effect. So as simply as it sounds, it is. The microsimulation, the rationale of the microsimulation it's very straightforward, even though there are a lot of identities, basic equations, concepts, etc. to work on, but they basically that is the rationale, and the complexity is not about the concepts and the equations, but to make sure and to understand the multiplicity of programs, rules, requirements, and who at the end is the target population. So we can properly identify this target population in our household survey. So at the end we can simulate. So why it is important? Because it is important to include the redistribution system, the social expenditure side, into the question, because it is closely interrelated with the taxation side, right? For instance, if one government aims at increasing the rate of the value-added tax, the direct effect of that change in the tax would be a reduction in the purchasing power capacity of households, of some households at least, right? In a magnitude that for some households, that change could even move those households into an extreme poverty condition, for instance, right? So the household, the government ideally would like to compensate that that lost in the well-being condition of those households. So probably the government will design a new instrument to compensate, to transfer some specific amount to those families, right? So both policies, taxation and redistribution, are interconnected. One cannot exist without the other, especially the redistribution. And the second importance of studying this part of studying redistribution is because social expenditure is, at the end, a significant element of the available resources of households, right? So household income is composed not only by the amount of money they can receive from remittances, from the labor market, or from donations from family members or other households, neighbors, etc., etc. Especially within poor populations, and depending on the country, the amount of income, of household income that is accounted for social transfers could be significantly higher, as much as, I don't know, 30%, 40%. So, including the analysis of social expenditure is crucial in these exercises, because it is a significant part of the well-being of households, and it is also interrelated with the other system, the taxation side. So the effect of social redistribution on the well-being of households and individuals is not only not occurs only in terms of cash, in terms of transfers, of public transfers made in cash, right? So, for instance, as I said, for a poor, let's imagine a poor individual, a poor household, they receive a public transfer as part of a conditional cash transfer scheme. So this household sends his children to the school as a condition, so they receive a transfer, a cash transfer that increases the amount of available resources, available income by, I don't know, 30%. But it's not only that. I mean, that is the component that we see, right, immediately. But there are other components of social expenditure that are not that evident, which is, for instance, the in-kind transfers, basically those related to education and some elements of the health system, the public system, right? So, for instance, I am a poor individual in Mexico, and the winter season is approaching, so I know, because my relatives say so, I think it is the right thing to do. The public information systems tells the same, etc., etc. So I know I have to apply to get a vaccine against flu, for instance, right? Okay, so I go to the public health facility, and which I have right to that. So I get my vaccination, right? And what is the cost of that? For me, zero, none. It's only the energy to walk from my house to the public facility, or the monetary cost of a transportation of a ticket for commuting, right? But if that service is not provided by the government, and I have the same information, it is important to get a vaccine for the flu season, And this is a question: will I be willing to go to the pharmacy, to the drugstore, and pay for the same vaccine with my own resources? Probably not, because probably the cost will be high enough to disincentivize my interest. So I will face the winter season without that vaccine, right? Because yeah, the cost could be probably high. So if you imagine that what the government is doing is to absorb the cost of something that I wouldn't be willing to pay, or I just simply can't pay, you can think of it as a sort of invisible income, right? So I am getting a service, I am getting a good that without the government I just simply can't have. So the money I am not spending on that good or service because I am not willing to, because I prefer to assign, to allocate that money to another more essential good, etc., etc. That could be understood as a sort of saving, as a sort of invisible income, which plays a crucial role in the well-being of households. So, of course, if you ask a poor individual or even a non-poor individual, and you not ask, you say to that individual, you know what, you are reporting that your income is £2,000, but you know what, you are sending your children to the public primary, you are getting these health tests, etc., etc. So if we monetize those services, actually your income is not £1,000. It would be probably £2,500. And this person could say, no, you are crazy. You are talking nonsense. Yeah, I get that. But that is the rationale, and that is the importance of the redistribution system, which absorbs one important share of the monetary well-being of households, and that is important to be taken into account. Not as an argument to say that one individual is poor or non-poor, because yes, I agree with what you are probably thinking. You, Eduardo, are crazy. You cannot say that, yeah, I am crazy, and I agree with you. You cannot say that invisible amount that is covered by the government is part of your income, so in a way that you are considered or not considered poor, because yes, that is not something you see, something that you enjoy, and something that you allocate for something that you have, and then you allocate for different purposes to satisfy your consumption demands in the very short term. But it is a crucial component of your monetary well-being, something that you don't see, and something that you don't take into account most of the times, that accounts for an important share of your well-being. And that could be approximated, not in terms of poverty. The effect of these in-kind transfers can be approximated not in terms of poverty, because I agree that doesn't make any sense, but it could be approached to explore what could inequality be if we monetize those services, right? So that is an exercise that can give us some extent of the effect of social transfers made in kind, right? It's somehow it's a way to measure the extent of the impact that social policies can have on the well-being of households. And that is why we included the final income concept into the concept, into the scheme of income concepts that you studied in your unit 2. So it is important, right? Not only because it is important to study the social part, the redistribution side, not only because it's closely related to the taxation side, but Even more importantly, because it affects in a significant manner, the well-being of individuals. So, okay. So that is basically the rationale. So, any potential policy we want to simulate, any potential policy the government wants to implement or to change, we have, and this is a recommendation, we cannot study that policy as an independent policy in terms of its effects on the well-being of households. We have to consider the whole system. So, what I am saying, for instance, if the government of Costa Rica, so let's repeat this typical example. You travel as a consultant, you travel to Costa Rica to construct a microsimulation model. So you have all the information, you have a team who knows how the system works, etc., etc. And the government tells you that, look, the reforms I want to implement consist of increasing the value-added tax by 15%, from 10% to 15%. Okay. I would like to know what is the effect on poverty. Okay, right. So you, as a specialist, you cannot say, okay, I will measure poverty now without the tax in the status quo, and I could say that poverty is 30%. Oh, that's fine. So now I explore, I work with my data, etc. I identify the amounts of the value-added tax paid, and on those I will add the 15% instead of 10%. So I obtain new income and measure poverty, and I can observe that the poverty is not 30%, 35%. So, and I will say the government, look, your reform will have an effect of increasing poverty by 35%. Oh, that could be true, but that is incorrect. You cannot say that the effect is on poverty of that reform is simply that. You can, of course, say, look, this policy, this change, of course, will increase poverty. Of course, this new tax is regressive, etc., etc., etc. You can make a lot of evaluations just for that policy intervention. But at the end, you have to take into account what will be the effect on poverty by increasing the value-added tax and then adding the amounts of social transfers, etc., subsidies, because why? Because at the end, once the whole system, both the taxation and the redistribution systems, play their role, then you can measure poverty again and say to the government that, you know what, poverty was 30% in the status quo, now it is 31%. So if you implement this fiscal reform, poverty will increase just 1%. So the cost is not that high. And you will get a lot of resources, so you can probably design a compensation policy for those individuals, etc., etc. So there is a huge difference between 1 percentage point increase in poverty compared to the first 5 that we obtained by just measuring poverty just after adding the new value-added tax. We have to consider the combined effect, and that is the logic of the rationale of separating the different income concepts, and that is why, that is the rationale of taking into account the redistribution system, because the redistribution system could be that good that even though the government increased the value-added tax from 10 to 15%, the social cost was not that high, because actually in the status quo there are very good, well-targeted policies covering the poor population that are probably the more prone to suffer the consequences of an increase in taxes. So you can see it is not a 5 percentage point effect. It is just one, right? So this is just to illustrate the importance. So and this reminds me to an actual example which occurred in Guatemala. It's the opposite situation, actually. In Guatemala, we look for the actual figures, and we see that poverty in Guatemala is 50%. Half of the population lives under the poverty line in Guatemala, right? Okay. So when disentangling the different effects of each component, we observed that the pure effect of social transfers was a reduction of poverty by 7 percentage points, from 50 to 43%, for instance, right? The figures I am mentioning are not actual. The situation is actual, but the figure, I don't remember the correct, so I am using 50 and 43 just for the sake of simplicity. Okay? So, what I am meaning, as you remember that in that we start with a market income, which is basically wage, remittances, etc., and salaries, etc. Then you subtract the direct taxes paid, and then you add the social transfers, and you can have a different income concept, which is called the disposable income. So in this case, in this example for Guatemala, starting from the market income, if we add the social transfers, what we notice was that poverty, instead of being 50% as in the status quo, now it is 43% as a pure effect of the public transfers. So that's, you from the perspective of the government, you can say, wow, this is fantastic. I mean, the effect of the transfers I am implementing, it's fantastic. I mean, let's continue doing this, But you as a consultant could say, no, wait for a minute. Wait a minute. This is great, actually. Public transfers are capable of reducing poverty by this magnitude. That's true. They are pro-poor, they are progressive, they are well-targeted, etc., etc., etc. But let's measure poverty once we have discounted the indirect taxes and the subsidies, etc., etc. And let's talk again. What happened in Guatemala is that now, starting from the disposable income, we subtract the amount of taxes that people pay by consuming goods, that is, the indirect taxes, the VAT, etc., etc. Poverty went back to the 50% and even more. Let's say 51%. I mean, that is, poverty increased. So it is even higher than the status quo. How can be that possible? That's it, because the great positive effect of social transfers was completely counteracted, nullified by the huge weight of the indirect taxation system. So now the story to discuss with the government is, wait, yes, your transfers are good, but the households are not increasing their income. I mean, households are not, the process doesn't stop by giving individuals a transfer amount. After that transfers, individuals have to live, have to consume. And what they pay for every service or good they consume, they absorb more than what you are giving in transfer. So the whole effect of the whole system is nothing. There is no effect on poverty. It could be even higher, an increase in poverty. Right? So illustrations for you to take into account that while it is important to measure the effect of independent interventions, to make an analysis of whether they are progressive, are pro-poor, etc., the overall evaluation of the effects on inequality and poverty on the whole population, that should take into account the whole system. And why is that important? That even though the government is only interested in increasing taxes, you cannot just implement a microsimulation for the tax system to simulate that increase. You have to simulate the whole system, because that is a completely different story that probably will determine the design of a new social policy, right? So how we construct, how we implement these exercises and what we report, it is crucial. It is not only for academic purposes and that's it. I mean, this can have an actual huge effect on reality, right? On the lives of a lot of population, actually. Okay, so having said that, that is the rationale. That's it. We have to take into account that part, this social expenditure part, the redistribution side of the puzzle, so we can have better results, more comprehensive view of the system, so we can recommend the right policies, or let's call it that way, the right policies based on robust evidence. So for you to implement and for you to analyze this piece of the puzzle, and similarly to what we discussed in the taxation part, you have to be aware, you have to know how the system works. What are the programs? Who is the target population? What are the rules and what are the requirements? And this is where this is what makes this part of the puzzle very complex. And I would like to explain to relate this subject to a typical dilemma. From the perspective of governments, of the policymakers, probably you are policymakers, right? And you want to implement to design and implement a specific direct transfer. You know that you have just limited resources, fiscal resources that comes from the taxation side. That is the interrelation between both. So, but okay, you are interested in targeting some population, in implementing a new policy. You will be faced with a typical dilemma, which is a dilemma that has triggered a spirited debate over the last years about focalization, universalization versus targeting, right? So we should provide the services and the policies to everyone, or we should create just subsamples of the population according to some criteria. So that depends on the possibilities you have in terms of fiscal resources, but and there are of course other more complex factors which are related with productivity issues, etc. Right? So, for instance, if you decide and implement the universal basic income, I mean that is fantastic from a social point of view, right? It is fair, it is equitable, it's fine, right? It's simple, okay. But there could be some people who argue that, okay, but in order to do that, you need some resources, some fiscal resources to guarantee the sustainability of this universal income over the next year. Other people will say, okay, yes, but if you implement that, you will be disincentivizing productivity, labor, etc. So people will prefer to stay at home to receive the basic income, not to work. That could have effects on productivity. I mean, there will be a lot of arguments, a lot of reasoning, different reasoning, etc., etc. So it is a dilemma, right? Let's keep things simple, and let's imagine that you are a policymaker who can implement a policy, a transfer. So let's say that you want to transfer some money to the largest share of the population as possible, right? So let's say this, right? Let's imagine this is the poor population, right? So the poor population is composed by all this population. And what do you need in terms of criteria or in terms of requirements to implement this? Probably just one requirement, this one, which is being poor. If individuals are identified as poor, so all of these will be recipients of these transfers. And then your colleague will tell you, no, wait a minute. This is a country with a very large share of poor population. So let's add another requirement because we don't have the enough resources, right? Okay, so let's say that, okay, population have to be poor, but also live in rural areas. So this is a second requirement. And based on this requirement, you will cover just this share, a lower share of the population, right? And then again, another colleague will tell you, no, this is still a lot of population. We don't have the resources. We have the resources for this fiscal year, but not for the next. So we have to be more carefully with this. So, okay, so not only being poor and living in rural areas, let's say This household has to be headed by a female with 2 children. Okay, so we will only cover this part, right? Okay, so this is a nice, not a nice, sorry the adjective. This is a straightforward way to represent this dilemma. The dilemma on the target population you want to cover and the type and number of requirements you have to implement in order to keep the target population feasible in terms of fiscal resources, right? So from the perspective of the government, what it is important to bear in mind this in the perspective of the consultant, in the perspective of the individual who is implementing the microsimulation, because for starters, you have to understand this relationship. Why this government is implementing this policy, or why this government implemented this policy in the past, because what I am observing here in the set is that individuals are not satisfying the 1, 2, or 3 requirements. So what is happening? Probably I can recommend a different targeting mechanism, right? Or as part of the diagnosis of the microsimulation. Or if you want, or if the government is intended to implement a change on social policies, not on taxes, but on social policies, this is a good, very simple, straightforward tool, a representation of how you can analyze the potential reform. So you can, okay, you want to implement this change, and you only have these amounts of fiscal incomes, and poverty is this size, and the privations are X and Y, etc., etc., etc. So this is the rationale behind of recommending a new policy change, which is something you have to understand before starting the microsimulation, something you have to diagnose during the microsimulation, and something that you can recommend based on the different microsimulations you are implementing. So what is the best transfers you can implement based on what you have? What will be the best number of population benefited, and how can reach that population based on what requirements, etc., etc., etc. So this is just a simple representation of a rationale that is very powerful for you and very useful for you to deal with when implementing a microsimulation. So this is helps, at least in my case and in the case of Alberto and Ivan, the other colleagues, when we are doing microsimulations, and when we starting in doing this is a very simple scheme to get things better in terms of the diagnosis and in terms of the recommendations we can provide, right? So try to solve in the most cost-efficient way this dilemma, right? As you might recall from the last week, we discuss the relationship between the government and household, which is a relationship of agents, if we can say that. So this process of designing a transfer also responds to the type of transfer we want to implement, or the government want to implement, and we want to simulate, right? So the type of transfers, and this is why it is important to understand the multiplicity of transfers, subsidies, and policies put in practice, how they operate, what are the requirements, what are the rules, because based on that previous knowledge, we can, from a technical perspective, we can simulate those policies in our dataset. So for instance, and sorry for using these identities, these are just written for you to review them later with more time. These are very, very simple equations, just to represent the main message, which is the government want to transfer. The government implements several policies to distribute resources through social policy, through cash transfers, in transfers, subsidies, etc. The type of these policies respond or depends on the type of households, the type of the target population. Right here, what I want to be, what is the target population? What defines that target population? And this is on the requirements, right? And that will be useful as well to implement the policy accordingly to characteristics of that target population. So for each household, which is marked with blue, let's imagine that this household, it's a not poor but a near poverty household, who owns a small business. They produce, I don't know, they produce tortillas, tortillas. So for that, they consume a lot of electricity to operate the machine that makes the tortilla shape, right? So the government could say, okay, you consume X quantity of electricity, let's say 100 kilowatts, and you pay an amount, a certain amount per kilowatt, which is denoted by P. So price times quantity, it equals the amount that you pay monthly in your electricity bill. So the government could design a policy and say, you know what, instead of paying that full price, let's say I will cover half of the price. So that's a subsidy in amount, right? So your household will pay at the end of the month, you will pay the quantity you consume, the number of kilowatts you consume, times the reduced price. So probably you will be consuming more. Now, if you before consumed 100 kilowatts for $10, for instance, now you will consume the same 100 kilowatts for only $5. Or now you can increase, which is the idea of the policy, you can increase your consumption from 100 to 200 and pay what you paid before, the same $10. So the idea is for you to consume more and then to increase your production, for instance. So based on that, you can sell more and have more income, right? So this is a very common policy across Latin American countries, right? So why are we writing this as an equation? Just an identity to observe, for you to familiarize with this language, with these notations, because these equations are the type of equations we will be dealing with in the exercise, right? So if you have a column of quantities, right, for each household, for each household, what they consume on a monthly basis, and you know the price, so it is straightforward to multiply the quantity for each household times the price, and then you will have another column with the result, right? So these are just basic identities to represent the concepts and to represent the rationale. So this is another way in which a government implements a policy, a subsidies policy, for instance, again, to these households. In terms of reducing an amount of the price, the government could say exactly the same logic. Okay, you consume X quantity of goods and pay this price, P, so I will cover, as a government, not a specific amount, but a specific share. Let's say 80% of the tariff will be covered by the government, and you household, you will pay only 20%. So it is a different representation, right? So as a percentage, because this represent a proportion, a percentage, right? Number one, if you multiply times 100, it's 100%, right? Minus this share, so it's the same working with units from 0 to 1 than working from 0% to 100%, right? So let's think about as subsidy as a share. And the another obvious possibility is the direct transfer, right? So if you have the amount of income reported by households in the household survey, so this household is reporting they earn 500 pounds, and they also receive a transfer, a direct transfer in cash, which is 50 pounds. So that equation is equivalent to this expression, right? So as you can see, it is simple language to represent the different identities corresponding to the different concepts that we will be working on the exercise. But the important part for you to bear in mind is the relationship, right? These criteria. Who are the target population? Based on what requirements are the target population based? And based on that identification and rationale, what are the best policies the government can implement to tackle the needs and the requirements of that target population? And like this, there are a lot of policies, a lot of instruments, some very efficient, other more efficient, etc., etc. But what I want to say is that the multiplicity, the number of policies and instruments that follows these different representations are a lot, and we have to be able to represent them, to capture them in the household survey, based on what people reported and based on the external information regarding the rules, the norms, the legal criteria in which each policy is built on, right? So we can disentangle in our household data set the different interventions. So, for instance, as you may recall, one example we mentioned some weeks ago, if you open your household data set, what you will have is a vector, a column of incomes reported by each household. So our goal is to decompose that individual amount. So if a household reported 500 pounds, we have to be able to capture what is the amount corresponding to direct taxes, what is the amount corresponding to the direct tax on beverages, what is the amount paid corresponding to indirect tax paid on food, on health services, on alcohol, on property, and of course, on what is the amount household received from subsidies and from cash transfers. So at the end, and you can notice this, we are starting from a single column of aggregated incomes here, and at the end of the microsimulation, we will have multiple columns of different taxes, of different social transfers, of different subsidies with different amounts that if you sum up, you subtract the different elements at the end, that equation should equal this total amount originally reported. So, as you can see, or as you can think, it is important for the service for you to have, it is ideal for you to have all the required information in the same household survey, but as we mentioned it before, we don't always have that. So based on the rules of each program, on the criteria, the legal criteria, the external information, we can implement some of the techniques we discussed some weeks ago, which are simulation, imputation, so we can deconstruct these specific amounts. By having these columns, we simply can sit with the government and hear about their goals. So they want to change this social transfer. Okay, so we implement a change on this vector of values, and that's it. That is basically the microsimulation, right? Disentangling and transforming the individual concepts that we have identified. It is important.
Eduardo,
Hello?
please stay connected. Hi, Eduardo.
I am so sorry. I don't know what happened. It just stopped presenting and said that I had to reconnect. I don't know why.
Okay. Yeah,
Okay.
you lost your sound. Okay.
Okay. I am so sorry about this. Okay. So, so yes, you open your household survey as from the perspective of you as a consultant, and you see that this household has reported 500 pounds. And luckily, you know that out of these 500, there are 100 pounds that corresponds to cash transfers, conditional cash transfers. But you know, based on your previous evaluation of the different systems, of the different programs, etc., you know that in the country there are at least 10 different cash transfer schemes, right? So you don't know to what program, to what of these 10 programs corresponds, what share of the 100 pounds. That is why it is crucial to understand who is the target population for each policy in the country and what are the requirements, not only for you to recommend a new policy or a change to better improve how a policy is working, but also for you to understand and for you to properly simulate the effect of any change in this program. So you know the requirements and who the target population should be for each of these programs. So based on that, you can say that, oh, based on if this household is poor and also is rural and it also is composed by 2 adults and 2 children, and it's located in the south part of the country, and I know this household received transfers, and given the characteristics, I know that out of the 100, at least 10 correspond to these specific programs according to the rules, right? So this is a simulation or an imputation exercise based on what we review and based on the information of the program. So as you can see, this is this is just the rationale of these things, and you can have a better sense, a practical sense of this when we review the exercise on December the 4th. These slides are, I think I can stop in a very few minutes. This slide describes the importance of subsidies. We also, I think I described that, the different types of subsidies, and of course the importance of income transfers, no, in terms of education and health, and how they affect the well-being of households, even though they are not part of the disposable income of households. No, it's just a good and service the household can consume, and of course improve or affect households' well-being. So it is important to take into account this. And that's it. I mean, I have here a note on poverty measurement because we designed an exercise for the Unit 6 in which you have to measure poverty. A very simple exercise. I mean, you have to obtain some of the taxes and social expenditure in that exercise. But to measure some impacts, you have to measure poverty. So I am not sure if you have to measure poverty, if you are part of the track that have to measure poverty. But given that, I think that Olga, if he's here, she can confirm. But anyway, I think it is worth mentioning this note, right? So because of what? There are at least 3 reasons because we wanted to include this note on poverty. The first one is that from the very beginning of the course, we have been mentioning a lot about poverty and the effects on poverty and that on poverty and that on poverty. And we are assuming that you know how to measure poverty. And even though it is a very simple procedure, the rationale behind measuring poverty is quite complex. And I mean, measuring poverty has covered, the literature on poverty has spanned for about 4 decades, from this paper by Sen up to now, when we are dealing with the multidimensional poverty measures put forward by Sabine Alcaer and James Foster, and 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 circulated by the UNDP and OFI in Oxford, right? So it's a lot of discussion. It is a lot of issues, and because of that, a second reason is that it could be a good idea to probably design a course, a virtual course on poverty measurement, covering the different approaches, covering the different indices, based both in monetary terms and in multidimensional terms. And the third reason is, the exercise, for you to be able to solve the exercise. Okay, just to finish this this note, and I'm sure you know about this, probably you know how to measure poverty, and the rationale is very simple. Sen suggested in his very famous paper of 1976, published in Econometrica. Amartya Sen discussed a lot of and developed a lot of axiomatic properties for the poverty indices to satisfy, right? And that paper actually set the stage for the subsequent literature we know now. But in that paper, and beyond the complexities in the technical axioms and properties of the poverty indices, Sen discussed the two basic steps to measure poverty. One is the identification, which is concerned with the assessment at the individual level, that is, who is poor and based on what. And the second step is aggregation, which is basically the idea of taking the individual information, of summarizing the individual information into an overall indicator of a society, right? So it's basically the assessment of the living conditions, not at the individual level, but at the level of a society based on the individual information. So let's assume that we are measuring poverty in terms of income. In fact, when dealing with microsimulation exercises, the effects of any fiscal reform is based on income. So let's keep it simple and say that an individual is poor if his or her income are just simply below or at or are equal to the value of the poverty line, right? And if the individual income is above the value of the poverty line, then this individual is non-poor. So as basic as it sounds, that is the individual assessment of poverty. And the same applies to other dimensions. I mean, do you have access to water or not? So if you don't have water, you are deprived in that dimension. If you have water, you are non-deprived in that dimension. If you have less than primary school, then you can be probably deprived in the educational dimension. If you have above more than 6 years of schooling, then you are not deprived in the education dimension. So the identification stage deals with if you can notice, it is not, it is very simple. One individual is poor or not poor, or non-poor, right? In that critical specific dimension. But as you can notice, behind this simple procedure, there are a lot of very complex issues to be solved, which is, what is the main indicator to measure individual well-being, to ascertain that an individual is poor? It should be income, it should be consumption, it should be schooling, or any other characteristics. So the first issue to deal with is what is the relevant dimension, or what are the relevant dimensions of well-being. Secondly, what should be the threshold above or below which we can ascertain that an individual is non-poor or poor, respectively, right? In terms of income, we have the poverty line, the typical poverty line. How we obtain the poverty line? It's a very complex exercise. It has to be with the type of goods individual consumes, which are based on the caloric and energy requirements, etc., etc. So, but basically the poverty lines is a basket of goods, let's say food, that individual requires to live on a daily basis, and the amount, the monetary amount of, the value of those goods in the market, it's an amount of money needed to be considered poor or non-poor, right? So if we compare individual income against that predefined threshold or poverty line, we can identify an individual as poor or as non-poor. So the identity is very simple. It's ridiculously simple, and I am sure you know about this. You are poor if you have less than the poverty line, and you are non-poor if you have more than the poverty line. But the discussion behind the why and the poverty line are very complex. Even though, in addition, in determining the why, there is another deal. There is another issue to deal with. What should we use? Per capita income or what? Imagine a household of 5 individuals, right? So 3 individuals within that household earn money from labor, right? While the other 2 individuals, no, because one of them is a children who is not engaged in labor, so he or she didn't receive money, and the other other member is an elderly individual who also is out of the labor market, but he or she receives transfers, non-contributory pensions. So how you can evaluate that individuals within that household are poor or non-poor? So the basic and the simple way is to sum all the incomes within that household, that is to sum the 3 incomes from labor for the 3 first individuals, add the amount of non-contributory pensions for the elderly, and then divide the total amount by the total number of members. 5 individuals, including the children, the kid, the child, right? So that in that way you can obtain the traditional, the very simple, direct per capita income. So if you compare the per capita income against a per capita poverty line, so you can evaluate poverty at the individual level. So by definition, if one individual of those households, of that household is identified as poor, the rest of individuals within that household are also identified as poor because all of them have the same per capita income, right? If you prefer to see it as a unit, not at the individual level, but as a household, at the household level, so then the household is poor, right? It's the same. The average of the income within that household, it's exactly the per capita income. So that household and every member of that household is poor. But there is another option. You can say, you can be thinking that it's not fair to assign the same amount of income to the children who is not engaged in work, or the elderly individual who is not engaged in work. Or you can argue that the child has different needs, etc., and you are right. Yeah? Children goes to the school, so they require school supplies, or they consume a less amount of energy. So exactly, the necessities are different within the household. And in order to account for that, there are some techniques to divide the total income, the total household income, by a different number, which is not 5, which is not the household size, but it is an adjusted household size, which is adjusted by some factors. And this technique relates, or it's known as the equivalence scales, right? So in that way, you are adjusting the total income by the type of individuals who compose this household. So, but in any case, in either case, the identification of the poor is simply the same. Individual income, both either per capita or equivalence scale based, against the poverty line, right? And then how you can report the poverty level of your country, of your society, using your household survey, you just simply divide the total number of individuals identified as poor in the previous equation by the total population, right? That will yield a percentage. So for this example, let's assume that our poverty line is 120 and the total population is 15. So we have the 15 individuals here, and we have the income for each individual. So you can say, okay, this individual is poor. This is poor as well, because it's equal or lower than the poverty line. This is poor, 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 and poor, right? So you have, I don't know what happened, but you have 9 individuals in poverty. If your total population is 15, so you divide 9 by 15, and you can have that 60% of the population is living in poverty, right? Just simple as it is. And if you work with a household survey in which these are your rows and these are your columns, you can, instead of counting and identifying with the finger who is poor, who is not poor, you can create another variable, which is a variable, positive entries of ones and zeros, where 1 identifies an individual as poor, whereas a 0 identifies an individual as non-poor. So if you have ones and zeros, you can calculate the average of those ones and zeros, and you can have exactly the same 6%. So this is a very straightforward way to measure poverty in a household survey, by identifying them with ones and zeros. So I hope this will be helpful for your exercise. We are not requesting anything more complex than this. And that's it. Sorry for the time. It took me more than 1 hour. I promised to be to make a short presentation, and I just simply couldn't. And on December the 4th, I don't remember the time, but on December the 4th, we will discuss this microsimulation exercise from the A to the Z in order to review all the concepts, all the taxation side, all the social expenditure side, and the impacts on inequality and poverty. So based on what you have read and based on what you have heard in these webinars, we expect, we hope that you can have a better understanding of all the concepts you heard and read on that in that additional and last webinar. That's it, and yeah, that's basically it. If you have questions, comments, please just go ahead, or think about comments and questions, so you can come on December the 4th and ask your different questions. And yeah, and that's it. And yeah, we will explore the possibility of at some point that during the next year, we'll discuss it with the UNDP colleagues, so to see how viable is to implement a course on poverty measurement. So that's it. Thank you very much. 8 a.m. on December the 4th. Right. Okay, if you don't have more questions regarding the content, well, I hope you have a great weekend, a fantastic rest of the day, and we'll meet next Monday. Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to be here. Thank you.